If you've ever used a handheld emulator like the Odin or an emulation box like a RetroPie, you may have noticed something about the software that they're running. Pretty much every single one of these devices are running either straight up Linux or something based off Linux like Android. And I mean every single one. Raspberry Pi, Retroid Pocket 2, the Steam Deck, even though that one is a hell of a lot more than just an emulation device. Honestly, the only exception to this that I've seen are things that use like FPGA tech like the Analog Pocket, but those aren't really emulators, at least not in the sense of it runs software. Those are recreating the hardware with like a special programmable CPU thing that I don't know a terrible much about. Well, I'm going to tell you why, or at least why I think why so many of these companies go with the same operating system on all of these different devices. So why is this? With so many of these emulators that these devices use being available on things like Windows or Mac, why is it always running Linux or Android? Well, it's probably a few reasons, but before we get into all that, make sure you like the video and do a side B on that subscription button. You know, like side B, you know, like Smash Bros, which is a game I totally know about, because I've got more of these videos I want to make, and if you guys want to see them, you need to make sure you subscribe and smash the bell, because you want to get notifications so that you can comment all the things that I get horribly wrong, or just point out the small detail that's going to bother me when you point it out. Jokes aside, if I actually do get something wrong in this video, feel free to actually correct me in the comments. I love learning more about this stuff. So the first reason is probably that these operating systems are free. I mean, yeah, now I know that looks obvious. I mean, why would you pay for something when you cannot pay for something? Yeah, it's obvious. Mac and Windows are both locked down behind some kind of paywall. For Mac, you technically can get it for free, but you have to only use officially supported Apple hardware. Using it on something that Apple doesn't support is against their terms of service, so you really can't do that, especially not for a product you're selling. And Windows, you have to buy a license for every individual device you install it on, which can be like $200 per device, unless you were able to get a deal with Microsoft where you can buy licenses in bulk like a bunch of laptop companies do. And while these restrictions definitely put macOS completely out of the question for anyone to use on these devices, it doesn't completely eliminate Windows. I mean, we've seen other handheld devices that run Windows instead of Linux, so why not that? I mean, just look at all of the other handheld PCs that aren't the Steam Deck. They're all running Windows. Why don't these portable emulator devices do the same thing? I'm sure there must be some sort of bulk discount they can get. We can boil these reasons down to the hardware that these portable emulators use. These things aren't powerhouses. They typically only run the bare minimum needed to run the systems that they're trying to emulate and that they come with. Throwing in having to also be running Windows, which can be very demanding, especially on lower end hardware, and suddenly what consoles you can emulate gets drastically reduced because you're having to spend so many system resources just to run the operating system. Plus, these things tend to struggle with anything 3D, so having even more system resources taken up by just the OS alone is really going to hurt your performance. Imagine you're playing PS1 games, but because of Windows, it's eating up so many resources that you can't get above like 15 frames per second. Wouldn't really be a fun thing to play, now would it? And speaking of system resources, another thing that's freed up in your system is storage. A Linux OS tends to be much smaller than Windows by like tens of gigabytes. I think Windows now is like somewhere around 20 to 40 gigabytes just to install it. The Steam Deck's OS, I think is less than 10. Do you know how many extra Super Nintendo games you can throw on to an extra 10 gigabytes of storage? It's the entire SNES library 5 times over. You can store every Super Nintendo game 5 times in less than 10 gigabytes of space. Needless to say, having more storage out the gate is drastically better for a device that's supposed to be able to carry around most, if not all, of your entire retro game collection in one place. Now, I'm not trying to say Linux is like the superior OS for retro gaming, though as a Linux user myself, it is my preferred option. If you want to see what playing games is like on Linux, you can check out my Twitch where I do that all the time and do dumb mistakes. It's a good time. Now, a bunch of these devices also use Android, which, while being based off Linux, is not Linux itself. There's a big old convoluted reason as to why that's the case. I'm not going to go into that because I don't fully understand it myself. Just know that Android used the Linux kernel, which is like the base's minimum core version of Linux, and use that to build Android off of. That's about as deep into it as I'm going to go. But how does that fare against Linux as an alternative? Well, it's a little bit different. Android does provide most of the same benefits to Linux for a retro console, though not always to the same extent. Installs can be a bit larger than some really minimal Linux installations, depending on what versions you're comparing. For example, you could completely custom install like Gentoo or Arch Linux, and it will probably beat out every version of Android in terms of storage size, but Android might be smaller than a more graphically fun. I can't say this line. For example, you could completely custom install something like Gentoo or Arch Linux, and it will probably beat out every version of Android in terms of storage size, but Android might be smaller than a more graphically focused Linux distro with a whole desktop included like Pop! OS or Linux Mint. Android also has other advantages, namely that it is dramatically more popular than Linux. It's actually the most popular operating system in the entire world, beating out even Windows, because everyone's got a phone these days. Not everyone's going to buy the super expensive iPhone. The only real option left is Android. So everyone's got it. Though that is a bit unfair since desktop and mobile are completely different markets, but the point remains that it is extremely popular. This means it's easier to find support from the community when there are bugs and issues. It's easier to get well-made and up-to-date documentation for pretty much everything in Android. Android has a development suite that you can run on almost any computer to build apps. It's just a much friendlier setup for developers to make stuff on Android, at least from an outsider's perspective. But there you have it. My, I guess, theories about why so many of these emulation boxes and portable emulators all end up running the same two operating systems. What do you think? Did you get it right? Was there something I missed? It probably was. Leave a comment and all of that down below. If you like, hit the like button. If you hate it, I guess do nothing since dislikes don't matter anymore. Screw it, hit the dislike button anyway. If you didn't like it, then hey, maybe they'll bring it back one day and you want it to be recorded that you disliked this video. Get subscribed, ring the bell for notifications to new uploads. You can support me over on Patreon where I upload videos early, and I've got socials and stuff all in the description below. Watch me on Twitch, all that good stuff. Have a good one. Peace out.